I am Safwan Masri. I'm Executive Vice President at Columbia University for Global Centers and Global Development. And it really gives me great pleasure to welcome two colleagues that I admire and respect a great deal, Jelani Cobb and Farah Griffin, whom I'll introduce more fully in a second. In a way, in preparing for this webinar, I found myself thinking that I wish that this webinar wasn't necessary, but it is. With the recent deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, and countless others, America seems to have reached a tipping point again. And this time, the impact appears to be global. While there has been so much focus in the media on the protests, criminal charges, promises of police reform, what has been missing, in my view, in this discourse, with rare exception, is an appreciation of the long trajectory that has led to the current moment and an appreciation of the deep-seated structural and cultural factors that have ensured that racism in America endures, and how and why these must be addressed for an equitable and just American society to emerge. This is not just about police reform and sensitivity training. It is about education, about facing our history, and about confronting our sins. It is about understanding profoundly and deeply a history that is glossed over, not taught or understood. We also need to understand, I think, why this moment in American history has ignited protests across the globe and what that all means. Today, I have with me two preeminent scholars who can help us look at and understand from a scholarly and historical perspective the Black Lives Matter movement. Farah Griffin is chair of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. She's the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's Bazaar, and her books include Harlem Nocturne, Women, Artists, and Progressive Politics During World War II, and Who Set You Flowing? The African American Migration Narrative. Jelani Cobb is the Ira P. Lippman Professor of Journalism at Columbia School of Journalism. He is a contributing writer to The New Yorker and countless other publications. His articles have appeared in the Washington Post, Essence, Vibe, and The Root. Jelani is the author of The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama, and The Paradox of Progress. Thank you for being here, Jelani and Farah. You have been incredibly busy over the past few weeks. I've seen your writings and I've seen you comment on the protests in various media channels. So I want to start with a personal question, if you'll allow me. You both are academics, you're scholars, as I am. As such, we are used to, as scholars and academics, approaching a subject with objectivity and appropriate detachment. But this historical moment has to feel different. For both of you as African Americans, this isn't just professional, this is personal. And I can relate to that, and I can ask this as somebody of Middle Eastern roots, who is of Palestinian descent, who is openly gay, and so on, which has its own narrative with discrimination, perceptions of threat, and law enforcement. So I wanted to ask you, can you speak to this? Can you speak to to your personal reactions to this moment? And I'll start with you, Farah, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here for this conversation. I think that it's always hard to separate my identity as a scholar and as an intellectual from my person. But you are right that this moment in our time, I think my first response was just a kind of weariness, and just like, under what conditions are there any conditions under which we don't have to tolerate and deal with a kind of slaughter in the street, so that initially I was weary, but I think that the writer in me, the intellectual, the scholar immediately kicked in. And also someone who I would say personally realizes that I come from a tradition of struggle and protest. And so that after that initial weariness, or in addition to that additional weariness, it's like, what do I do? What do I need to do? Where do I turn my skills as a scholar, as a researcher? What do I write? How do I speak out? How do I bear witness to this moment?
Mm, wonderful. Jelani, what has it been like for you?
I mean, it's interesting because uh, it's it's really interesting that you bring up your Palestinian ancestry because I've thought a lot about Edward Said, in the last weeks and months, in the sense that we have these intellectual interests and these areas of inquiry, and we also see the direct ways in which those interests are connected with broader things in the society that we are not immune from, in fact, that we are exposed to. And, when I'm leaving Columbia's campus, I emerge into the world of people and not thinking about me as Professor Cobb. They're thinking about me as a 6'3" Black man. And those are very much realities that, I navigate, I mean, hopefully on Columbia's campus, I'm not being thought of that way. I don't want to make it seem like those two worlds are not, permeable. But but it's also been, I think, a particular kind of difficulty because even doing this work means not being able to take a break from it, not being able to distance yourself. And the video of George Floyd's death was, traumatizing. And I've only seen a snippet of it. I refuse to watch the entire 8 minutes and 46 seconds of it. But you can't get away from that. Like I have the commitment to do this both in the work that I do as a scholar and in my journalism work. And so I think the great difficulty is not being able to ever find, distance.
Right. So let's stay with the video, Jelani, if you don't mind, even though, I mean, as you said, you haven't seen the whole thing. Is the fact that we've had this video, which shows, I mean, very, very clearly what happened with a man dying under a policeman's knee, or, being shot in the back, and other cases, different narratives have emerged, from watching these videos. So two questions come to my mind that I'd like you to address. I mean, is this a contributing factor to what makes this protest movement different? What is different about this? I mean, it feels different, and many experts have said that it is different. What makes it different? And then I'll follow up with my other question.
So I think that there are a lot of things, and being a historian, I can take the historian's prerogative to say, we don't know exactly how different this is until 25 years from now. But in the moment, what appears to be different or what feels different, I think, can be attributed to several things. One of which is that, unfortunately, we have seen very many African Americans die on video, at the hands of law enforcement, most often shot, and I think that the public, at least a certain portion of the white public, has built-in plausible deniability around these things. So there's always the question, oh, we don't know what happened before the video started, or the officer was fearing for his life, or this was just a split-second decision, anyone could make a mistake. There are all these things that are used to mitigate the reality that African Americans are disproportionately likely to be killed by law enforcement.
Right.
You can't do that with someone who is asphyxiated over the course of a nearly 9-minute video. And the kind of casual detachment that we saw in that officer's eyes as he went about the business of ending Mr. Floyd's life is stunning and staggering, and it doesn't leave room for alternate interpretations. Even as there are people on the sidewalk saying he's dying, and it elicits no response from the police officer or the 3 other officers who were there on the scene. Right. That's one thing. The other is, I think, that we have a pandemic in which we've seen African Americans die at triple the rate of other people, particularly white people, and a recession in which African Americans are again disproportionately impacted. And so the cumulative effect of all these things was, and also the fact that people were out of work. So people just watching the video, and they could go out and protest and not have to worry about going to work in the morning. And so I think all of those things combined to make a moment that was unlike the other moments we've seen where situations like this have occurred.
Mm-hmm. Farah, do you agree? I mean, is this a sort of what's your analysis of what might make this moment different without having the benefit of the, looking from 25 years from now back at what this might signify? And I think, the pandemic probably played both ways, right? I mean, people are sitting at home, they're watching what's happening, they're getting angry, they want to go to the streets, and at the same time, many of us are afraid because of the pandemic and afraid of being in crowds. So, Farah, what feels different about this, if anything? What was triggered by the George Floyd death that's different from countless other deaths before him?
Well, I think Jelani is right. I think there are a couple of other things too. Young Black people have been hitting the streets since Trayvon, right?
Right.
Those young people around Mike Brown, those young African Americans who faced down tanks on the streets of Ferguson. What's different this time is that they aren't by themselves. So that it's not that something different was triggered for Black people, because the response has always been what we're seeing. It's just what's different is how diverse those crowds of young people are. And I think that there are a number of things that are there. These are young people who have, if you think about it, I've been reading about girls who are 15 organizing protests through their 20s. They aren't the hardest hit. They haven't been the hardest hit by the pandemic. So you're not seeing people my age, for the most part, in the street night after night. There are also young people who have watched over and over and over again. My dear friend, Elizabeth Alexander, calls them the Trayvon generation. Tamir Rice would have been 18 graduating from high school. So he's their classmate. I mean, these are young people who have grown up the latter part of their teen years watching this over and over and over again. There are also young people who have been, whose sense of culture and their identity is shaped by a popular culture that is largely Black. So I think that they might have a sense of inequality that's a little, that Black people deal with, that might be a little bit different from their parents. So I think all those things. And I think that, we also have to keep in mind that this is happening in a moment of a presidential administration that, quite frankly, is like one we have not seen before in terms of its explicit commitments to a certain form of white supremacy. Not that we haven't had white supremacists before, but like this, and also people who have suffered from the incompetence of the way the pandemic was handled. So you have all of that frustration. And I think that this was just the tipping point that allowed for an explosion. It's almost like a perfect storm. I think the core would have always been a core of young Black people out there fighting and protesting like they've been doing for a decade, but something else just made it, all these factors that I'm sure scholars will study, 25 years from now.
Right. Right. So, and by the way, just to the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to forward any questions that we will try to address during today's webinar. So you mentioned, Farah, Elizabeth Alexander, which reminded me of another Alexander. I'm not sure if she's related, Michelle Alexander, who wrote in the New York Times soon after the protest started what I thought was really a brilliant piece that basically talked about the importance of understanding history and highlighting great American writers. And this is, you're a great American writer, and that you've commented about great African-American Black writers. And what was really great about her article is that she also, she mentioned names and books and so on and why they are valuable. To what extent do you think that lack of education, that lack of sensitivity, culture. I mean, you talked about some of the structural issues and the political moment that we're living in that have led to, I mean, Jelani, you mentioned the cop and the look in his eyes, you know, and you know, the way that you characterized it, that did not come from nothing. You know, that is something that has been you know, sort of ingrained and has become perhaps part of American DNA. You know, sorry to be generalizing, but so you understand what I'm saying. So what are your thoughts on that? The role of, you know, the have we failed in terms of ensuring that things were taught, you know, that the civil rights movement, to what extent is it addressed? Is it not in our school curricula, in our university curricula? Do we celebrate great Black writers and authors in our mainstream core humanities curricula? And both of you, you know, who teach at Columbia, can perhaps, you know, comment on that from your own experiences and what you have seen. So I'll start with you, Jelani, on that.
So, I mean, there's been tremendous progress in terms of access to the important works produced by African Americans in this country. The past decade has seen an amazing resurgence of interest in James Baldwin's work. You know, you now see, you know, James Baldwin on T-shirts, and I participated in an event where people did a 24-hour reading of Baldwin's work. You know, and so, you know, those kinds of things are much better than they were in earlier years. That said, I think that the structural issues that we're trying to address persist, not because people are not familiar with, you know, cultural things, but it's because they have an incentive, you know, be it ideological, be it economic and material, whatever the incentive is to maintain those sorts of conditions. And so, you know, we have, and you looked at 1967 and saw what happened in Newark, New Jersey, where there was a huge uprising, you know, gigantic uprising of people in response to an incident of police brutality. And here we are in 2020, where we have the same sort of uprisings happening for the same reasons. And so the saying is that those who fail to understand history are doomed to repeat it. And I've always heard that and said, yeah, and sometimes we repeat history precisely because people understood it. Saying that this was the whole point. The point of it was to be able to do it again and again and again. And so I don't think that the people who are opposed to us on the other side of this are naive. And so I think if I could quote Noam Chomsky to end my comment here, he said, speaking truth to power in terms of being able to have access to like writers and this information. He said, Chomsky said, you know, speaking truth to power has always been greatly overrated because power generally knows the truth already. However, how else could they be so good at obfuscating it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, thankfully, you know, those writers are available. And what, you know, I teach them to my students. And I'm so inspired by the young people who sit in my classroom. But they aren't the ones who are, you know, who are choosing to maintain the system and the structures as they exist. As Jelani said, almost every instance of a kind of urban uprising has been sparked by an act of police brutality. The Harlem, you know, riots of 1943, 1935, 1964, North Philadelphia. I mean, over and over and over again. And I would say that we are in a moment with a kind of explicit resurgence of people who are committed to that kind of violence and maintaining those structures, and who actually feel that they have been threatened, right? That there have been some progress on the parts of Black Americans, gay Americans, women, and that they've been threatened, so they have to double down. And double down in every way that's available to them, whether it's through the courts, whether it's through the United States Senate. and whether it's through violence and police brutality on the streets. I mean, I don't think it's a question of ignorance. I think it's a question of what kind of America are we going to be, and people choosing sides, and this being a moment of reckoning.
Wow, interesting and a little bit scary. I mean, basically one interpretation of that was you tried in 1935, in 1943, in 65, in 67, and every time since then. And we're doubling down. I mean, what Jelani has said. I mean, they know the truth and they want to double down on it. So, I mean, if we look further into the underlying issues behind this, and Caroline Rand, as you probably saw, the Nashville poet, recently wrote a powerful, again, New York Times opinion piece about how to frame the American past around its Confederate history. And she begins with a shocking first sentence: "I have rape-colored skin." I'm sure you've read this. Can you speak to how this fits into the movement and where we are now? I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is about so much more than what we're talking about out there in the media. And this is basically what you're saying, what you're telling me, right? I mean, it's reinforced again and again and again, and it is so deeply rooted in what she expresses in that piece. Farah?
Well, I think that one of the things that that piece does that's necessary and important is that we live with a mythology, and Jelani can speak to this better than I do, but we live with a mythology of the Confederacy in the Old South. And it is, and that was a project. It was a project to create that mythology and to have people invest in it. And that one of the things that her piece does, that Ms. Randall's piece does, is say, let's talk about what that really was. Like, I'm a daughter of the Confederacy too, right?
Right.
I'm an object of the Confederacy too. And that if Americans have the courage to really look at our history, what they don't want to face is that, the brutality of that period, the brutality of that moment, and what it stood to uphold, right? And that this moment provides, and I think the pandemic does this in some ways, it shines a light on things, it uncovers things. This is a moment to uncover and to challenge those myths and to show why they were constructed and what kind of work they were doing and how they succeeded, so that people can actually say, unchallenged, this is my heritage. Well, okay, well, what heritage is that really? It's America's heritage, but let's talk about it. It's more than hoop skirts and, plantation weddings on plantations. And that's what her piece is forcing, and, forcing us to look at just how brutal and ugly that history is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States has never been capable, ever been capable of actually looking its own history in the face, not collectively, not in a general sense. And one consequence of it is that the country has been permitted to consider itself exceptional. And so, do the indigenous people of this continent think the United States is exceptional, who were 100% of the population when the American colonists arrived, and who are now about 1% of the population of the United States? Do they consider this to be an exceptional society?
I think we might have lost Jelani.
We lose Jelani?
Yes, he'll come back. He'll come back. We'll make sure that we don't lose him. So let me turn to you, Farah, on that theme, and I want Jelani to finish that thought because it's so important. So he's talking about the deep history, right? He's talking about the long history and how that continues to have an impact. And when you look at one of the things that, in thinking about this and preparing for today's webinar, that I was struck by is, we always heard Martin Luther King's often cited quotes, one of which is, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And President Obama, of course, has used that in many of his speeches. What many people do not know, and I did not know until recently, is that this quote was adapted from the writing of a 19th century Unitarian minister and abolitionist, right? Theodore Parker. And if you'll allow me, I'll read the entire quote for our audience. Theodore Parker said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." This was 200 years ago. Is the arc still bending towards justice? Where are we on its trajectory? And maybe Farah, you can answer this. And Jelani, glad you're back. So we'll come back to you because you were on a very important trajectory in terms of a thought that I would love for you to finish.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I want to hear Jelani. That's a quotation that means so much to us. And I think it's a quotation for people who are in the midst of struggle, who don't see it, right? Who don't see things bending toward justice. And it's a reminder, a kind of hopeful reminder that we aren't struggling in vain, that the universe bends toward justice. My husband actually titled one of his books using that phrase. What I've always believed is we as human actors bend it towards justice. It is by our action and our response to injustice that it bends towards justice. And I think we're in one of those moments where a generation of young people joining what has been a 400-year struggle have said, okay, you know what, we're gonna bend this thing in the right direction. So that's always been my take on that quotation.
Jelani.
I don't know where I dropped out, but I'll just reiterate that, what I was saying is that we have never really had collectively much tolerance for the entirety of our history as a country. And because we've cooked the history books in this particular way, we've been allowed to think of ourselves as exceptional. And out of that exceptionalism has come a kind of narcissistic or egotistic idea that we are above reproach and that we've never actually been subject to the gravity of human nature in particular ways, except that the people who are victims of this country understand the history in a particular way that they don't. And so that's why I said, do Native Americans think of this society as exceptional? They were 100% of the population when the colonists arrived, and now about 1% of the American population. The people who came here in the holds of slave ships believe that their experience they were dealing with exceptional people when they were offloaded and sold and bred, maybe exceptionally cruel people, exceptionally avaricious people in all these regards. And so the point about the prevalence of rape is something that white people in this country choose not to know, but every Black person knows this. And I don't mean like we get some knowledge of this as adults. I understood this as a child. When we would talk about why the people who are referred to as African Americans have complexions that span the entire spectrum, it was this arbitrary barometer of how much white lineage was forced into your ancestry. And we knew that. And so even the kind of question about Thomas Jefferson, where people were debating about what Jefferson did, and so there was a kind of an attempt to try to make it seem, before DNA proved the point, there was the attempt to try to make it seem that it was just scurrilous rumor that he had impregnated a woman whom he held in slavery, Sally Hemings. But I think for African Americans, it was a little bit weird, disconcerting. You're saying that, would we think badly of Jefferson if we knew this was true? Like, no, we would think that he was like his peers. Like, there was nothing exceptional about what he did because it was so commonplace. And this is how we came to be who we are. And so I really appreciated that essay in the New York Times, because our bodies are literally the maps of what white people have done in American history. And they've had the luxury of never, ever countenancing that.
Yeah, yeah. How so? Here is a broad, perhaps somewhat naive question. You know all of this. I know a lot of this. Many people do. Not everybody reads the New York Times, right? Not everybody goes through the steps necessary to understand, the society that we live within. Uh, Societies shy away from facing their histories, and America has failed miserably in facing its history and confronting its sins. On a positive note, if we can, how do we move past that? How do we make sure that perhaps 25 years from now, Jelani, when historians like yourself look back at this moment, they can say something shifted. It wasn't only the pandemic, it was not the George Floyd murder and other murders that happened at around the same time uh, on their own, but something happened, something shifted in American society, and the process started that helped get us to a point now where I hope in 25 years from now, we have ridden our society and ourselves of all of this ill. I mean, Texas Congressman Al Green has talked recently about the national debt of reconciliation. We've got to have reconciliation. We survived slavery, but we didn't reconcile. We survived segregation, but we didn't reconcile. We are suffering invidious discrimination because we didn't reconcile. It's time for us to reconcile. How does society reconcile? Is that even possible in the span of 25 years?
Sarah, I feel like we should have Aubrey in this conversation. He could speak to that. Her husband would speak to that question, I think, with more insight and perspective than I could, and perhaps you'd say the same.
Yeah.
Well, we'll do this again with Aubrey.
And I think he certainly thinks, he's a scholar of religion and politics, and so he thinks about reconciliation. But Jelani, do you have thoughts on that question?
I mean, I think that, so one of the things I think is that I don't presume that things are as bleak as they appear, because there has been progress, usually at great expense and through great difficulty. And so I don't look at it as, 1935, 1943, 1965 as all kind of barometers of our failure. I look at it as us having a learning curve and understanding how to adapt to these questions and how these issues are. Because, if you were to talk to, slaveholders, they never believed that system would collapse. Or many people who were enslaved who might not ever think that system was going to collapse. And then inside the, fiery conflict of the Civil War, it died. People never intended for us to get out of segregation, and it did. And I think there are like international examples. We were talking to people in East Berlin, they would probably say the same thing about the wall coming down. And I mean, I think there are all these examples where the edifice of a system that is inhuman and appears to be impregnable crumbles and seemingly out of nowhere, but it's actually a result of just eons, years and years and years of effort on the part of people trying to move us to a different place. And so I think about that in that sense. And so the reconciliation, I think, is one part of it. It's possible, but I also think that in this country, we have lots of attempts at reconciliation. They're just cheap. They're kind of dime store attempts at reconciliation, wherein we pretend that our main problems with race are the product of misunderstandings and hurt feelings, right, as opposed to saying that the problems are structural inequities. And so if we want reconciliation, we have to actually be willing to change fundamentally the way that the society has operated.
Right, right. because for culture to change, you have to make the structural transformations,
Right.
Perhaps first. Farah, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Jelani. I do think, and I also have, I listen to the organizers, the Black Lives Matter organizers. I listen to the young people, and they have a critique and an analysis that to me says that we've made some progress. These are young people who have access to ways of thinking that they would not have had. A core group of people would have had it, but it would not have been as broad. They have access to a language and a vocabulary and a way of understanding history that really makes me hopeful, that some things are different. And I feel like we're facing a moment, I was in last fall, we were in parts of Italy and Greece, and I was looking at all the ruins, the ruins there. And I was reminded of something that Toni Morrison often writes about, that these were civilizations, and civilizations die, right? And that we build new worlds on top of them. We build new ways of being on top of them all the time. And, America is always, it's got this wild innocence, right? And we always think of ourselves as new and fresh and innovative. But history teaches us that great civilizations fall and die, and they often do so from within, right? And that's also human history. That's also human history. And so I feel like we're at one of those moments where it's like, what are we going to build? What are we going to do? How do we move forward? Or are we just kind of looking at the ruins? What we're going to be? People are going to look back and say, oh, that was a great civilization. They gave us baseball. It feels like one of those.
Yeah. It's good to be reminded that we are but sort of a spot, a period, a moment in a very, very long history. And thank you for bringing up Toni Morrison, because it reminds me, you had such a beautiful tribute to her as a revolutionary, as a political thinker. But this is what I mean. The Toni Morrisons and the James Baldwins of the world, and what they have contributed to the great literature of Black America. And ultimately, that is reconciliation, is understanding at a very human level the personal stories. So let's talk about the global dimension of all of this. It's all, of course, related to this, and then we'll turn to the audience's questions. Were you surprised by the intensity and the scale and the scope, the global scope of the protests? And I think, to me, this was one of the things that made this protest movement of Black Lives Matter different, perhaps, than Ferguson, Missouri, or other protest movements before this. What do you make of this? What does this say about worldwide systemic racism, right? In Africa, South Africa, its history of apartheid colonialism, the fact that you had people in Australia, in France, in England, in other parts of the world take up the Black Lives Matter. Were you surprised by this? And how, what do you make out of it? And, for me, one of the conflicting things that I have been thinking about this is, or one of the conflicts is, to what extent is it supporting the Black Lives Matter protest movement in America, which is about racism in America and about Black Americans? To what extent is that movement helped or perhaps hurt by it sort of becoming about more local and regional issues elsewhere in the world? I'd love to hear thoughts from both of you on this. Farah, you want to start?
Yeah, I was heartened. I was absolutely heartened. And I think that there are other moments where, first of all, you feel like, okay, well, we're not alone in this. I also think that Black Americans are so often like the canary in the coal mine. And that the ways that our country, and it is our country, has behaved toward us is the way that it has often behaved in other parts of the world. And so I think that people are particularly sensitive to that. And, you know, so that it's not the first time that we've had a kind of global response. The movement to free Angela Davis was a global movement. I mean, I saw marches all over Europe. I saw marches in Nairobi. I saw marches, you know, that there are moments when the Black freedom struggle in the United States becomes global. And I think that it's because it's part of a kind of way of also contending with America. And I'm also not so concerned about when it becomes local. I'm not that concerned about that because I think that there are relationships to be forged between these movements, that sometimes movement in one place cracks open a set of possibilities in other places. And I guess I'm not as concerned about that. I mean, I think I am grateful for the attention that people all over the world have given to this. And I also think that it's a chance to acknowledge kind of ongoing what is also happening locally, because what can happen is other places can say, oh, look at America. You know, I had a journalist ask me, explain America, because we don't have that kind of thing. And I was like, yes, you do. You know, it might not be exactly the same kind of thing, but, you know, they're folk you need to be listening to, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a fine balance, and I'm not as concerned about the relationship between the two.
That's great. That's great. And Jelani,
I think it's largely the same thing as Farah about this. One thing I would add is that you know, the United States has always been, because it considers itself the kind of indispensable nation, it's always been profoundly susceptible to international embarrassment. And you know, that's why they were so offended when abolitionists would speak in Europe. And you know, when Frederick Douglass went to London, and you know, people were outraged by it. And when Ida B. Wells went to Europe and talked about lynching, people thought that this was outrageous. When Paul Robeson talked about racism in Geneva, and they destroyed his life as a result of it in the middle of the 20th century. Same thing with W.E.B. Du Bois. Like, there's been this historic thread but at the same time, those movements have been made much more effective precisely because the United States is so keenly susceptible to embarrassment and international condescension on issues of morality. And so I think that this has been really important, especially when you see that there are countries that the United States has antagonistic relationships with, pointing to what happened to George Floyd as an example of why the US should not lecture them about what they're doing in their own societies. And certainly that's cynical. You know, I don't want Mr. Floyd's death to become the mechanism by which other people are exploited in other places. But it also does mean that the United States can't talk one way and behave another way, that the whole world sees it for what it is. And so I think that was like really heartening. And otherwise, I think I agree with everything that Farah said.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the worst thing that can happen is for regimes, if you will, to justify their own behavior, because they're saying, and if this is happening in America, why can't it happen here? On the other hand, I mean, you know, as many of we have a lot of comments and a lot of questions. Some of them I think we've addressed organically, but I'm reminded also by some of the questions is, you know, we talked, if we can talk specifically about Brazil, and if we can talk about sort of, you know, France, and why the protest movement has resonated in those places. And I'm reading here from Sarah Mehta, who writes that the BLM movement has resonated with communities of color around the world. The protests emerging in France, Brazil, and the UK aren't just about solidarity with the Black community in the US, but engage with the local experience of racist policing and legacies of imperialism and slavery in those countries. What type of reckoning there may be outside the US, and if there are more or fewer prospects in any of those countries? She asks. Who'd like to take that?
I mean, I can't speak to it because there's so many different. Like that's a doctoral dissertation. That's not like.
So Sarah, if you want to pursue a PhD, we might help you get one at Columbia. But go ahead. Yeah.
But I mean, I do think the one kind of small thing I'll say about that is that I was impressed by the extent to which people were making these things their own, and they were using what happened here as a window into talking about the things that were happening where they are, and recognizing that there are, because there have been these kind of kindred connections among movements of people, after World War II in the 1960s and so on. We've seen this happen before in the anti-colonial decolonization movements, and various ways in which what happens in one place can be a window into discussing what's happening in a entirely different set of places. And so I was happy to see that this was part of that same tradition.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think so too. I think that it's almost like a series of dominoes, and that what happens out elsewhere influences us here, that the toppling of a statue to a famous slave trader, I think, preceded the toppling of the monuments to the Confederate soldiers here. And I think that there are also places where there have been long-standing relationships between social movements, between Afro-Brazilians, and some African Americans, and I think that those networks of connections are drawn upon in a moment like this.
Right. So, staying out there in the globe outside of the United States, Jelani, and we've talked about this, you've referred to this moment in America as the American Spring, sort of relating it to the Arab Spring, something that I've studied and written about. And actually, just to divert for just a second, in writing about Tunisia and its success sort of as the only country to have emerged out of the Arab Spring with a functioning democracy, one of the fascinating things I came across was its history with slavery, because Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, had been a major trade center between sub-Saharan Africa and Europe and the Ottoman Empire and so on. And in 1846, 19 years before we abolished it in the United States, Tunisia abolished slavery. And in 1863, there was correspondence between the resident consul of the United States with the Bey of Tunisia, asking him about the benefits of abolitionism. So that was incredibly fascinating. But so with Tunisia as the hook into it, where are the similarities, Jelani, that you might see between those protest movements that are still going on in the Arab world? I mean, the Arab Spring started in 2011, but I don't think it has finished. So what do you see as similarities?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are cautionary tales and role kind of examples of it if we're talking about this. But one of the things that came up, it was not my observation, but it was pointed out to me, the similarities between Mr. Floyd and Mr. Bouazizi, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, in Tunisia, who was the vendor.
Bouazizi, yeah.
Bouazizi, who had been abused by the police, and the system had shut him out, prevented him in sequential ways, serial ways of earning a decent living. And then there was just one insult that was at the end at the hands of police. It was too much when he had his wares taken from him by police officers. And when he self-immolated in protest, saying that there was no way for him to live in that society. And it took, an immensely powerful person who was brought down by a very humble man, a regular person in the community. It was not an army. It was not forces that were subsidized by some foreign government. It was simply an idea that was embodied in this person's life. And the same thing with George Floyd. I mean, people talked about this at his memorial service. He was a regular man, someone without, great titles or distinctions, but, people whose community, someone whose community understood his value and whose family understood his value. And in his death, people saw a window into their own experiences. Now, the other kind of irony of this is that the Trump administration, which is more and more aptly referred to as the Trump regime, behaved in the way that an autocrat would behave, by issuing threats, by sending out federal forces, by using military helicopters to intimidate civilians. And so, being held in check only by the level of compliancy of the sycophants behind and beside him. And so we saw that same sort of thing. Now, I don't presume to say that this will bring about a toppling of the American government. But I think in the piece that I wrote, it was like it may prompt a reconsideration of the relationship of power between that government and the citizens from whom it is derived. And I think that in itself is significant.
Yeah. So on that, I want to follow up on that, and then I'll have my concluding question to Farah, because we are unfortunately
I actually have to dip out a little bit early because of another commitment. So I can't stay for the last question, but thank you.
Thank you, Jelani. This has really, really been great. It's been great having you, Jelani, with us. I mean, we have a couple of minutes, but if you have to dip out, we certainly understand that.
So thank you.
Thank you. Right. Thank you, Jelani. Thank you. So Farah, I mean, quick question that comes from Margaret Crosby Arnold, and the audience members, thank you for your great comments and questions. And sorry that always with limited time, we're unable to get to all of them. So there's a question which I've heard quite often, and that is this a moment or a time, and this moment, not the George Floyd moment, but I guess what we have been witnessing over the past couple of years to, according to Margaret, to re-bleach America post-Obama, the resurgence of hate consolidated in the last election, set in motion, and so on. I mean, is there a regression, perhaps a reaction that we have been seeing over the past few years with Trump stoking it? And what's your reaction to that question?
Yeah, at every moment of Black progress in the history of this country, there's been a backlash. So yes, there was a backlash. The election of Donald Trump was a response to, not only, but in part a response to Barack Obama. A lot of opportunistic people took advantage of that backlash because it also opened up opportunities for, deregulation and getting a more conservative court and all of those things that people weren't necessarily invested in. The racism of the backlash, but the backlash wasn't enough to stop them from riding the wave. So yes, I do think that. I think and I hope that perhaps the moment of the backlash will be more short-lived than it has been in the past. So after slavery, we have Reconstruction, and there were lots of things that was not just progress for Black people, but for American democracy. And the backlash against that brought us Jim Crow segregation, more violence, disenfranchisement, and it lasted for almost a century. So my hope is that that our response to this backlash will mean that it is much more short-lived. There are parts of it that we will be living with, no matter what. We will be living with certain kinds of judges on the courts, but perhaps we can stem the tide of some of the other more destructive things.
On that hopeful note, Farah, I can't thank you enough. Really, you and Jelani have educated us, you've instructed us, you've helped us understand and put things in context. And to our audience members, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your great comments and questions. I know that people around the world care deeply about this moment and care deeply about justice and equity. And, everybody, I think, is in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we really need to speak up and stand up. And unfortunately, this is not something that's going to go away anytime soon. So Farah, I hope that we can bring you back on the virtual stage of the Columbia Global Centers and have Aubrey and others engage in conversations about this. This is something that requires many, many, many hours of discussion to start to scratch the surface and understanding it. So thank you, Farah. Thank you for everything that you're
even
doing.
having us here. Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.